Tisa Samuppada, Dependent Origination, number 16. In the last lecture, we talked about the 11th link. Jati Pichaya Jara Marana Soka Paridewa Dukkha Domanassa Upayasa Sambhavanti. The 12th link. And it is the conditioning factor and conditioned factors. Today we are going to talk about the conditioned factor. Still more explanation on conditioned factors of the 11th link. And you can call it the 12th factor of dependent origination. So in Pali it runs like this: Jara Marana Soka Paridewa Dukkha Domanassa Upayasa Sambhavanti. In English, sorrow, lamentation, physical pain, grief, mental pain, and despair, intense, excessive mental pain arises. And then the Buddha at the end of the discourse, Buddha put a line like this: Evam metassa kevalassa dukkha khandassa samudayo hoti. In English, it goes like this: thus there arises the whole mass of suffering. So the 12th link, and the last sentence we are going to discuss today. We already talked about that last lecture. The 12th conditioned factor of the 11th link has two parts. The first two, Jara Marana. The first two is Jara Marana, aging and death. Is common to all 31 planes of existence. Aging and death is common to all 31 planes of existence. And the last 5, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair, is common to 11 sense realms. I believe you know what they are. 4 woeful planes, 1 human realm, and the 6 devil realms. They are called 11 sense realms. So this last 5 can be found in the 11 sense realm. The first 2, aging and death, can be found in every realms, all 31 of them. That's the first distinction we need to know. And all these eight, okay, including the conditioning factor, what are they? Rebirth, aging, death. So, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. They are called dukkha, suffering. Okay? For the human, let's focus on our human existence, human realm. For the humans, all these are called dukkha, suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering. Of course, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair are suffering, dukkha. So in here, I want to stress the first noble truth. The first noble truth. The noble truth of suffering is, can put it in this way, life or existence is suffering. Life or existence is suffering. That is the first noble truth. Or you can put in the strictest term, being constantly oppressed by the nature of arising and passing away of the mind and matter is suffering, dukkha. It's more clearer statement. Repeat again. Being constantly oppressed by the nature of arising and passing away of mind and matter is called suffering, dukkha, the first noble truth. But only when one understands this arising and passing away of the mind and matter experientially, then one can truly comprehend what suffering is, what dukkha is. Okay? That is in the strictest sense. In other words, one can truly comprehend what the first noble truth is, because that is suffering. So, that's the first noble truth. Then comes to a point. Why did Buddha taught us? Aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair as suffering. And all these are obvious suffering which we all know and understand too well. But Buddha still said these are suffering. Birth is suffering, old age suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair are suffering. Why did Buddha taught us that way as well? Aging and death have, if you remember, have two kinds of aging and two kinds of death. The obvious ones and the subtle one. The subtle one you can only see with your mind eye. or you can call it insight or wisdom, the mind, I. Only with that you can see the subtle one. The obvious one we all can. But without being profoundly affected or moved by the obvious aging or death, one would never look for the subtle nature of aging and death and its causes. You have to be profoundly moved, profoundly affected by these suffering. Only then you will look for the true nature or the subtle nature of aging and death and their causes. Let's look at the Buddha. The Buddha to be Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha Gautama started to look for deathless. We call it deathless. Started looking for deathless. Only after seeing old age, sickness, and death, these are the obvious suffering, on his way to a pleasure garden, summer garden. He was traveling on a chariot to go enjoy himself at the garden, and along the way he saw old men, sick people, corpse dead, and a hermit. Those moved him profoundly. I don't want to be like that. And then a thought arises, I'm going to look for the deathless. That is the one that moved him to move on. That is why we need these obvious suffering. It is a necessity on our part. Obvious suffering, old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair. Okay. These are of critical importance to put us on the path of liberation. It has a powerful shock value. It shocked the system of a person. All of us know these 8 factors are suffering. These 8 factors, the 12th of the dependent origination, the 8 factors are suffering. All of us who are listening and studying Buddhism and practicing Buddhism, 8 factors are suffering and are practicing to get rid of it. All the listeners are. That's what they are doing. They know these 8 are suffering and are practicing to get rid of it. Are we really practicing with conviction? That's a question we need to ask ourselves. Or are we riding the coattail of the practice because it gives us some relief from stress? See which part you belong to. When someone comes face to face with terminal illness, unbearable chronic illness, pain, disease, and a gut-wrenching failures of life, only at that point the person turns 180 degrees around from how he or she lived and start looking for something. Start looking for something to counteract the situation, to handle the situation. Only then they start looking, but not in the same old way, but totally in an entirely different way. That's what they do. Or pressed harder than ever on the path you know that could release you from these. In other words, the practice that you are doing now is with conviction. Before it is not. Now, after this suffering, you pressed on with conviction. This obvious suffering has a great value to put us on the Eightfold Path. For most of us, that's why human existence is considered precious by the Buddha compared to other existence. Let's see Brahma. They don't have any obvious sufferings. They are free from obvious suffering. Deva, I'll just pick a number out of the thin air. 99.99%. Their lives are filled with pleasure. Only when you're enjoying these pleasure, you forget to look for the release from the obvious suffering. Because you have no obvious suffering, you have only pleasure. So just think for yourself, when your life is doing great and good and everything going your way, you are just enjoying. You don't think about suffering and how to take care of suffering and how to protect yourself from suffering. That is the nature of the mind. And these Deva, only at the point near death, that is the time they suffer greatly. They starting to get scared. Their aura starting to fade. Only then they know they are going to die. But at that point, it's too late for them to look for remedy. That's what the Deva, for woeful state, have a constant states of obvious suffering. They don't have a moment without that obvious suffering. So these beings do not even have time to think for an escape from suffering. They're just struggling in the midst of suffering. Only the human has a mixture of pain and pleasure. But most of it requires some shocking situation to land on the path of Dhamma with commitment, without that shock and awe, suffering, kind of suffering, you don't really care about the path of Dhamma. But when it comes, you automatically turn around. Only for those who have a certain degree of Dhamma parami, a certain degree of Dhamma parami, get onto the path with lesser degree of shock. And a very few of us commit themselves to the Dhamma without any shock, because they are near the mature state. Still, these obvious sufferings are very useful for most of us, so that we land on the path of Dhamma with conviction. That's a reason Buddha specifically and appropriately put all these obvious suffering in the dependent origination discourse, covering on the third mode of time, the future life. It represents the past life, present life, and future life. In the portion of future life, Buddha put those appropriately. Okay, let's see how appropriately the Buddha put. Let's see at the present life. Okay, past life connected to present life. Sankhara picchaya vijnana, due to foolish karma formation, consciousness arises. Okay, the first one, of course. But because of these karma formation, actually 5 resultant factors arises. Buddha said, in the present life, resultant factors are, if you remember, relinking consciousness, mind and matter, 6 hand basis, mental contact and feeling. That's how Buddha put it. So, in the present life, Buddha showed us 5 resultant factors. And this present life, who are we? We are looking, we are here, we are human. So this present life is more focused and pointed for human existence. So these 5 resultants of the present lives are pointing finger at human existence. Okay. And Buddha also said, in the future life, in the portion of the future life, the resultants are, if you remember, rebirth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. 8 of them. These are the resultant. So, these future life resultants divided into 2 parts, if you remember. rebirth, aging and death. Jati, Jara, Marana. Is the result of the past life activities. Those trees are presented in such a way so that it covers all the 31 realms of existence. Put two pairs. Jati, Jara, Marana are the resultants which is common to all 31 planes of existence. And you can say all 8 of them. All 8 of them. I'll repeat again. Rebirth, old age and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. All 8 of them are the resultants that covers the 11 sense realm. 11 sense realm. That's why Buddha put it in a different way. At the present life, Buddha show us only the 5 resultants. And from the future life point of view, because in future life we could become any one of the 31. So he has to show all possibility that what we can become. But present life is human. Human is totally sufficient with these 5 resultants. Future life, it could be any realms we can be reborn based on our actions. So he showed us all 8. And all 8 are common to the 11 sense realms. I'm repeating these again and again and again so that we have a proper location. And also, why did Buddha taught us for our present life as a human these 5 resultants? Buddha didn't do anything without beneficiality, because these 5 resultants are very subtle. It's quite difficult, in fact, to know, to find, to understand. But he still gives us these 5 mental factors. The reason is to understand the intricate workings of these 5 mental factors. These 5 mental factors, in a way, is called subtle suffering. Suffering that we can see only through our mind. We can't obviously experience it. He shows us these 5 so that we could understand, at least theoretically, the intricate workings, the nature of the intricate workings of these 5 mental factors, which we call it subtle suffering. He shows us so that we may understand and then use it and then practice these 5 to attain liberation from all form of suffering. That's why he shows us in this fashion, this detail. And we have all of these in our present life as human. And of course, in the future life, the Buddha injected or showed us 8 resultants Why? To give us understanding, to give the human, because we are the one who is looking and studying, to give the human the understanding, the shock value of the obvious suffering. That's why he presented in a different way in the future life. Every words, every factors that Buddha put forward in theirs have a great significance and great beneficiality for us. So those are the 8 resultants, and try to see why Buddha put differently. You remember before? The past life, sankhara, karma formation, and the present life, bhava. Life action. Buddha put it in a different way and also stress one of the reasons for practicality, to practice. You can't really practice on ignorance, but you can practice on craving, grasping, activities, practicality. Let's move on to the last sentence. The last sentence of the dependent origination is, in English, thus there arises the whole mass of suffering. That's a conclusion, the statement. This whole dependent origination cycle of birth and death. The conclusion is, there arises the whole mass of suffering. Why did Buddha say this way? The Buddha pointed out this dependent origination is nothing but a whole mass of solids, mass of suffering. He wants to stress that. That's why the Buddha taught us in that fashion at the last sentence. He pointed out dependent origination is nothing but a whole mass of suffering. There's no pleasure mixed in this mass of suffering, not a trace. Of course, we use the word living beings, existent realms, because it is a conventional way of communication. That's the only way we can communicate from one to the other and understand. So we have to use these words, conventional way. But now Buddha cut out all the conventional stuff and said whole mass of suffering, which means things like I, you, me, a person, a man, a woman, an individual, or a self, or a being, or a soul. In fact, is a whole mass of suffering. All these things, identification that we put forth, in fact, are simply a whole mass of suffering. This mind and body is suffering. Let's look at it another way. These 5 aggregates, is suffering. And this mind and body, five aggregates are constantly oppressed by the arising and passing away, the nature of arising and passing away. What is this arising and passing away? It is dukkha, suffering, a whole mass of suffering. Mind and body is whole mass of suffering. Five aggregates is whole mass of suffering because they are constantly oppressed by the phenomenon of arising and passing away. Therefore, in conclusion, the Buddha didn't say dependent origination is about the arising of living beings. He didn't say thus there arise living beings. He didn't say that way. Just say thus there arises the whole mass of suffering. In conclusion, the Buddha said this dependent origination is the arising of the whole mass of suffering. In reality, there's no person, there's no self, there is no realms of existence, but only physical and mental phenomena which are inherently fused with arising and disappearing nature, or arising and disappearing phenomena. And this process is due to ignorance, avijja. Due to ignorance, this mass of suffering is believed wrongly as a person, an individual, a soul, or a being. We believe that way due to avijja, ignorance. May all of you be able to understand dependent origination clearly and thoroughly, and may you be able to apply appropriately into your practice of full foundation of mindfulness and attain liberation as soon as possible. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much.